The metal bars were cold against Lieutenant Jacob Morrison's forehead as he pressed his face to the window of the transport cage. Through the grimy reinforced glass, he could see the scorched remains of what had once been downtown Seattle. The Space Needle lay twisted like a broken finger against the orange sky, its metal frame melted and reformed by the alien heat weapons the Orcs had brought from their dying world. 3 months. That's how long it had taken them to break humanity's back. The cage lurched as the hover transport hit turbulence, sending the 47 prisoners inside sliding across the metal floor. Jacob steadied himself against the wall, his military training keeping him upright while others stumbled. His olive-drab uniform was torn and stained with mud and blood, some his own, most belonging to the soldiers he'd failed to save during the final stand at Joint Base Lewis McChord. Morrison. The voice belonged to Sergeant Elena Vasquez, her dark eyes meeting his across the cramped space. Despite being a prisoner for 2 weeks, she still carried herself with the bearing of a non-commissioned officer. Her black hair was pulled back in a tight bun, and a fresh scar ran from her left temple to her jaw, a gift from an Orc plasma blade during the Seattle evacuation. Jacob nodded toward her, then let his gaze sweep across the other prisoners. Most were military personnel like himself, survivors from various units that had been scattered during the invasion. But there were civilians too, engineers, doctors, scientists. The Orcs weren't interested in killing everyone. They needed workers for their vast mining operations, extracting the rare earth elements they required to fuel their war machine. Dr. Sarah Chin, a nuclear physicist from the University of Washington, sat in the corner clutching a tablet that had somehow survived the journey. Even now, she was scribbling equations, her mind working on problems that Jacob couldn't begin to fathom. Next to her, Master Chief Petty Officer Mike Torres cleaned his fingernails with a piece of broken metal, his weathered face betraying no emotion despite their circumstances. The transport shuddered to a halt, and Jacob heard the familiar sound of Orc voices, guttural, harsh syllables that sounded like rocks being ground together. The massive doors at the rear of the transport groaned open, flooding the cage with the acrid smell of sulfur and burning metal that seemed to follow the Orcs everywhere. An Orc guard stepped into view, its 8-foot frame barely fitting through the doorway. Like all of its kind, it was a nightmare fusion of flesh and technology. Gray-green skin was interwoven with cybernetic implants that pulsed with orange light. Its left arm had been replaced entirely with a mechanical appendage that ended in 3 articulated claws, while its right eye was a glowing sensor array that constantly swept back and forth, analyzing and cataloging everything it saw. "Out!" it commanded in heavily accented English, its voice emanating from a vocal synthesizer grafted to its throat. "Work awaits." The prisoners filed out slowly, blinking in the harsh artificial light of the processing facility. Jacob had been to 3 other Orc installations during his captivity, and they were all the same, vast structures of black metal and orange energy conduits that seemed to grow out of the earth like malignant tumors. The architecture was alien, all sharp angles and impossible curves that hurt to look at for too long. They were in what had once been the port of Seattle. The Orc facility sprawled across the harbor, its massive extraction towers reaching deep into Elliott Bay. Jacob could see human work crews operating heavy machinery under Orc supervision, their movements sluggish with exhaustion and despair. Automated defense turrets tracked across the sky, searching for any sign of human aircraft that might attempt to rescue. "Welcome to Processing Station 7, announced another Orc, this one wearing what appeared to be a command uniform, more elaborate cybernetic modifications and a crown of neural interface spikes. "You will be assigned work details based on your skills and physical capabilities. Attempt to escape, and you will be terminated. Sabotage equipment, and 10 of your fellow prisoners will be terminated. Refuse to work." "We get it," Jacob interrupted, stepping forward. The command Orc sensor array focused on him with a mechanical whirring sound. "You are the one they call Morrison," it said, accessing some internal database. "Lieutenant, United States Army. Responsible for the destruction of 3 of our advance units during the initial invasion." Jacob said nothing. During the first chaotic weeks of the war, his unit had managed a few small victories using improvised tactics and knowledge of the local terrain. It had bought maybe a day or two of extra time for the civilian evacuations, nothing more. You interest us, Morrison. Your tactical abilities will be useful in organizing work efficiency among your fellow humans. The Orc's mechanical eye whirred as it refocused. You will serve as a liaison between the prisoners and our overseers. I won't help you exploit my people. The Orc made a sound that might have been laughter, a harsh electronic buzz. You misunderstand. You will help us, or we will simply select someone else. Perhaps the doctor there, or the sergeant. The choice is yours. Cooperate and maintain some influence over your people's treatment, or refuse and watch helplessly as others make those decisions. Jacob felt the familiar weight of command settling on his shoulders. Even here, even as a prisoner, he was being asked to make impossible choices for the sake of those under his protection. He looked back at Vasquez, saw the slight nod she gave him. They both understood the game being played. What kind of work? He asked. Mining operations. Your people will extract the minerals we require while we continue our search for suitable colonization sites. The Orc gestured toward the facility with one of its mechanical claws. This world's magnetic field is adequate for our needs, though the atmosphere requires significant filtration. Still, it will serve as a staging ground for our expansion into this galaxy. As they were led deeper into the facility, Jacob made mental notes of everything he saw. Guard rotations, weapon emplacements, the layout of the complex. Old habits died hard, and despite their circumstances, part of him was already thinking tactically. The Orcs might see him as a useful collaborator, but Lieutenant Jacob Morrison was still a soldier. The prisoner barracks were exactly what he'd expected, long rows of metal bunks in a concrete building that had probably been a warehouse before the invasion. The food was a gray protein paste that tasted like cardboard, and the water had a metallic tang that suggested heavy filtration. But they were alive, and in the current situation, that counted for something. That first night, as the other prisoners settled into their assigned bunks, Jacob lay awake staring at the ceiling. Through the small windows near the roof, he could see the orange glow of the Orc facility's energy systems painting the sky. Somewhere out there, scattered remnants of the human military were still fighting, still hoping to find a way to drive the invaders back. The Orcs controlled the major population centers and most of the military infrastructure, but Earth was a big planet with a lot of places to hide. He closed his eyes and began to plan. 2 weeks into their captivity at Processing Station 7, Jacob had established a routine that served multiple purposes. Each morning, he would meet with the Orc overseers to receive work assignments for the human prisoners. Each afternoon, he would tour the work sites to ensure that quotas were being met and that no one was being worked to death. And each evening, he would file a report on the day's productivity. What the Orcs didn't realize was that these activities gave him access to nearly every part of the facility. The primary extraction shaft goes down about 300 meters. Jacob whispered to Vasquez as they walked between the dormitory buildings. To any observer, they were simply taking an evening stroll, but they were actually conducting reconnaissance of the facility's perimeter defenses. They've hit a vein of rare earth minerals that runs parallel to the old subway tunnel system. Vasquez nodded, pretending to examine one of the alien energy conduits that snaked along the ground. Torres thinks he can jury-rig some kind of explosive device from the mining charges they use in the deep shafts. The question is whether we can get enough of them to do real damage. What about Dr. Chin? Any progress on her project? She thinks she can overload their power grid if she can get access to one of the main fusion reactors. Says their technology is more advanced than ours, but it still follows the same basic principles of physics. Vasquez paused as an Orc patrol passed by, waiting until they were out of earshot. The problem is that the reactor complex is in the most heavily guarded part of the facility. Jacob had been thinking about that problem for days. The Orc facility was laid out like a fortress, with multiple layers of security between the outer work areas and the critical infrastructure at its heart. Getting a small team to the reactor would require a significant distraction, something big enough to draw off most of the guards. How many prisoners do we have with combat experience? He asked. Counting you and me? Maybe 15 with real military training. Another 20 or so who did basic service or National Guard. Vasquez's expression was grim. Not exactly an army. Doesn't have to be. We're not trying to win a conventional battle. We just need to create enough chaos to cover our real objective. They completed their circuit of the perimeter and headed back toward the dormitories. As they walked, Jacob noticed Dr. Chen sitting alone on one of the benches outside the main building, her tablet glowing in the evening light. He changed direction and approached her. Working late again, Doc? Sarah Chen looked up, pushing her wire-rimmed glasses up her nose. She was in her early 40s, with graying black hair and the kind of intense focus that Jacob associated with brilliant academics. Lieutenant Morrison. I was just reviewing some calculations. Mind if we sit? Jacob gestured to the bench. Chen nodded, and both he and Vasquez took seats beside her. I've been thinking about what you said regarding the power grid, Jacob said quietly. If we could get you to one of the fusion reactors, how long would you need? To cause a cascading overload? Maybe 10 minutes if I can access their control systems directly. Chen's eyes lit up with the prospect of putting her theoretical knowledge to practical use. The Orcs use a different approach to magnetic confinement than we do, but the fundamental physics are the same. If I can disrupt the containment field at just the right moment, the whole facility goes up in flames. Vasquez finished. More likely a very controlled fusion explosion that takes out their power infrastructure and most of their heavy equipment. The Orcs themselves might survive if they're in shielded areas, but they'd be stranded here without their technology. Jacob nodded slowly. A plan was beginning to take shape in his mind, but it would require precise timing and a lot of luck. What about their communications array? Could you disable that first? Probably. Their quantum entanglement communicators are more sophisticated than anything we've developed, but they still need power and processing capacity. Chen paused, considering. Why disable communications first? Because I don't want them calling for backup before we hit the reactor. Over the next several days, Jacob quietly approached other prisoners, feeling out their willingness to participate in an escape attempt. The response was better than he'd hoped. People were scared, angry, and desperate enough to take significant risks for a chance at freedom. Master Chief Torres was definitely in, along with most of the other military personnel. Dr. Chen had recruited 2 other scientists who could help with the technical aspects of the sabotage. Even some of the civilian prisoners volunteered to help, despite having no combat training. The breakthrough came when Torres managed to, accidentally, damage a piece of mining equipment, giving him access to the facility's maintenance tunnels while helping to repair it. The tunnel system was extensive, originally built to service the port's infrastructure but now adapted by the Orcs for their own purposes. More importantly, it provided access to areas of the facility that were normally off-limits to human prisoners. The main power distribution hub is about 200 meters from the reactor complex, Torres reported during one of their covert planning sessions. If we can take that out first, it'll force them to switch to backup power while we go after the reactor. How long before they realize what's happening? Jacob asked. Depends on how smart their automated systems are. Could be minutes, could be hours. Jacob spread out a hand-drawn map of the facility on the floor of the maintenance closet where they were meeting. He'd been working on it for weeks, adding details every time he discovered something new about the layout. Here's what I'm thinking, he said, pointing to various locations on the map. We split into 3 teams. Team Alpha, led by Vasquez, creates a distraction at the main gates to draw off the perimeter guards. Team Bravo, led by Torres, hits the power distribution hub and then moves to secure our escape route through the tunnel system. Team Charlie, that's me, Dr. Chin, and whoever else we can spare, goes for the reactor. What about after we blow the reactor? Asked Corporal Davis, one of the younger soldiers who had volunteered for the mission. Even if we escape the facility, where do we go? The Orcs control everything for hundreds of miles. It was a valid concern, and one that Jacob had been wrestling with since the beginning. The truth was that their chances of long-term survival were slim regardless of whether the escape attempt succeeded. But sometimes the act of resistance was more important than the probability of success. There are still human resistance cells operating in the mountains, he said. If we can link up with them, maybe we can make a real difference in this war. And if we can't? Jacob met the young corporal's eyes. Then at least we'll have struck a blow against the bastards who destroyed our world. The plan was set to execute during the night shift change, when the guard rotations would be at their most vulnerable. Jacob had spent weeks observing the patterns, noting how the Orcs relied heavily on their automated surveillance systems during the overnight hours. It would give them a brief window of opportunity, but everything would have to go perfectly. At 0200 hours, Jacob lay on his bunk listening to the sounds of the facility settling into its nighttime routine. The constant hum of machinery provided perfect cover for the subtle movements of his team as they prepared for the mission. Vasquez was 3 bunks away, and he could see her checking the improvised weapons they'd managed to assemble over the past week. Torres had done impressive work with spare parts and mining tools, creating everything from explosive charges to electromagnetic pulse devices. Dr. Chen was at the small desk in the corner, making final calculations on her tablet. She'd spent the last few days memorizing the layout of the reactor control systems based on schematics she'd observed during her work assignments. The margin for error was essentially 0. One mistake and the cascading fusion reaction could take out half the facility, prisoners included. At exactly 0230, Jacob gave the signal. Moving silently through the dormitory, Team Alpha began their infiltration of the facility's outer perimeter. Their job was to create a distraction large enough to draw the main security force away from the critical infrastructure areas, but not so large that it triggered a facility-wide lockdown. Jacob watched through the window as Vasquez led her team toward the main gate complex. They were armed with improvised incendiary devices that Torres had constructed from cleaning chemicals and mining equipment. The plan was to set fire to several storage buildings, creating enough chaos to pull the guards away from their normal positions. Team Bravo, led by Torres, was already moving through the maintenance tunnels toward the power distribution hub. Their route was longer but offered better concealment from the Orc surveillance systems. If everything went according to plan, they would reach their target just as Team Alpha's distraction began. Jacob waited another 5 minutes, then began moving toward the reactor complex with Dr. Chen and Corporal Davis. They'd chosen Davis for his electronics background. Before the war, he'd been a computer technician, and his skills might be useful in dealing with the Orc control systems. The route to the reactor took them through some of the most heavily monitored areas of the facility. Jacob had memorized the locations of every surveillance sensor, every automated turret, every patrol route. Moving in single file, they slipped through shadows and blind spots with the precision of a special operations team. The first explosion came exactly on schedule. A brilliant orange fireball erupted from the storage complex near the main gate, followed seconds later by 2 more blasts. Alarm sirens began wailing throughout the facility, and Jacob could see Orc guards rushing toward the perimeter. Emergency lighting bathed everything in a harsh red glow, making it easier to hide in the deeper shadows. Team Alpha is in position, he whispered into the comm unit he'd salvaged from a piece of mining equipment. Beginning Phase 2. The response from Torres came through clearly. Roger that. Team Bravo moving to primary target. Jacob's team reached the outer perimeter of the reactor complex just as the power grid began fluctuating. Emergency lighting flickered, and several of the automated defense systems went offline as Torres's team began their assault on the power distribution hub. The Orcs had built redundant systems, but they couldn't compensate for everything at once. The reactor complex was a massive cylindrical structure surrounded by layers of shielding and cooling systems. Dr. Chen had explained that the Orcs used a more efficient fusion process than human technology, but that also made it potentially more unstable if the magnetic containment fields were disrupted properly. They encountered their first real resistance at the security checkpoint outside the reactor building. 2 Orc guards stood at the entrance, their cybernetic enhancement allowing them to see clearly despite the reduced lighting. Jacob signaled for his team to wait while he assessed the situation. The guards were positioned to cover the main entrance, but their attention was focused on the chaos erupting across the facility. Jacob could hear radio chatter from their communication devices as they received updates on the various fires and explosions. They were clearly confused about what was happening and where the main threat was coming from. Jacob made his decision. Moving silently around the edge of the building, he approached the guards from their blind spot. He managed to acquire an Orc plasma weapon during a previous transport, and now he brought it to bear on the unsuspecting sentries. The first guard went down without a sound, the plasma bolt punching through its cybernetic chest plate and disrupting its main power core. The second guard began to turn, but Davis was already moving, striking it in the head with a metal pipe salvaged from the maintenance tunnels. The Orc staggered but didn't fall, its enhanced physiology allowing it to absorb damage that would have killed a human. Jacob fired again, this time targeting the guard's sensor array. Sparks flew as the delicate electronics were destroyed, leaving the Orc temporarily blinded. Davis struck again, and this time the alien warrior went down and stayed down. Entrance secured, Jacob reported. Team Charlie proceeding to primary objective. The interior of the reactor building was a maze of corridors and technical spaces. Dr. Chen led the way, following the schematics she'd memorized during her reconnaissance work. The air was thick with the ozone smell of high-energy plasma and the metallic tang of radiation shielding. They reached the control room just as another series of explosions echoed from outside. Torres was clearly having success with the power distribution hub, because more systems were going offline throughout the complex. Emergency lighting continued to flicker, and several of the reactor's monitoring displays were showing error messages. "This is it," Dr. Chen said, approaching the main control console. The interface was alien, crystalline panels covered with symbols that hurt to look at directly, but she seemed to understand the basic layout. "Give me 10 minutes and I can overload the magnetic containment field." "You've got it," Jacob replied, positioning himself at the entrance to watch for approaching guards. Davis moved to the secondary control station, ready to assist Chen with any technical problems. Outside, the sounds of battle were growing louder. Jacob could hear plasma weapon fire and the distinctive buzz of Orc energy shields. Team Alpha was clearly in heavy contact with the facility's security forces, but they were holding their position and maintaining the distraction. "Status report," he called into his comm unit. Vasquez's voice came back strained but determined. "We're taking casualties, but we're keeping them busy." "How much longer?" 8 minutes, Dr. Chen announced from the control console. Her fingers flew over the alien interface as she began the delicate process of destabilizing the fusion reaction. "The containment field is already showing stress fractures. If I can just..." The lights went out. Emergency power kicked in a moment later, but several of the control systems remained offline. Jacob cursed under his breath. Torres's attack on the power grid had been more successful than anticipated, but it was also making Dr. Chen's job more difficult. "I can still do this," she said, her voice tight with concentration. "But I'll need to access the manual controls. Davis, I need you to reroute power from the backup systems." Davis nodded and began working at the secondary console. Jacob kept watch at the entrance, but the corridors outside remained empty. The Orcs were clearly focused on containing the situation at the perimeter, not realizing that the real threat was right here at the heart of their facility. 6 minutes, Dr. Chen announced. Jacob's comm unit crackled to life. "Team Charlie, this is Team Bravo. We've completed our primary objective, but we're taking heavy fire. Multiple Orc units converging on our position. Acknowledged, Team Bravo. Execute extraction protocol and move to Rally Point Alpha." Torres's team had done their job. The power grid was destabilized and the Orcs were struggling to coordinate their response. But now they needed to get out before the facility's backup systems could compensate for the damage. 4 minutes, Dr. Chen said. Sweat was beading on her forehead as she worked to manipulate the alien technology. The reactor's containment field was becoming increasingly unstable, and Jacob could hear a low harmonic vibration building in the structure around them. "Contact!" Davis shouted from his position at the secondary console. Jacob spun around to see 3 Orc guards rushing into the control room, their plasma weapons already charging for firing. Jacob opened fire with his captured weapon, catching the lead orc center mass. The alien warrior staggered but kept coming, its cybernetic enhancements allowing it to function despite massive tissue damage. The second orc returned fire, its plasma bolt searing past Jacob's head and melting a section of the wall behind him. Davis threw himself sideways as the third orc targeted him, rolling behind the control console for cover. Jacob continued firing, trying to keep the orcs focused on him rather than Dr. Chen. The physicist was completely absorbed in her work, oblivious to the battle raging around her. 2 minutes, she announced. Jacob's weapon power cell was running low. He could feel the plasma rifle's energy output decreasing with each shot. The orcs had taken cover behind equipment stations and were laying down suppressing fire while one of them tried to flank around to Chen's position. Davis! Cover the doctor! The corporal popped up from behind the console and fired his improvised projectile weapon at the flanking orc. The metal slug struck the alien in its mechanical arm, disrupting the cybernetic systems and causing its weapon to discharge wildly. Jacob took advantage of the distraction to advance on the orc's position, closing to point-blank range before firing a final plasma bolt that dropped his target permanently. The remaining 2 orcs concentrated their fire on Jacob's position, forcing him to dive for cover as superheated plasma melted the equipment around him. Davis was providing covering fire, but his improvised weapon was no match for military-grade orc technology. 1 minute! Dr. Chen called out. Jacob could hear the harmonic vibration in the reactor structure growing stronger. Whatever Chen was doing to the containment field, it was working. But they needed to survive the next 60 seconds for it to matter. He reached for his last resort, one of Torres's improvised explosive devices. The blast would probably take out the remaining orcs, but it might also disrupt Dr. Chen's work on the reactor. Jacob weighed the options quickly, then made his decision. Chun! How sensitive is your work to electromagnetic interference? Not very. The containment field is already destabilizing. Jacob armed the electromagnetic pulse device and hurled it toward the orc positions. The explosion was smaller than he'd expected, but the EMP effect was devastating. The orcs' cybernetic systems sparked and failed, leaving them essentially helpless as their enhanced muscles seized up and their targeting systems went offline. Davis finished them off with his projectile weapon while Jacob rushed to check on Dr. Chen. 30 seconds, she announced. Everyone needs to get clear of the reactor complex. When this containment field collapses, it's going to release a lot of energy very quickly. Jacob grabbed his comm unit. All teams, this is Team Charlie. Execute immediate extraction. The package will be delivered in 30 seconds. They ran for the exit, Dr. Chen's tablet clutched in her hand as she monitored the final seconds of the containment field collapse. Behind them, the harmonic vibration was becoming a roar, and Jacob could see bright plasma flares beginning to arc between the reactor's magnetic field generators. They reached the building's exit just as the reactor went critical. The explosion wasn't as violent as Jacob had expected. Instead of a massive blast, there was a brilliant flash of light followed by a sustained energy discharge that cascaded through the facility's power grid. Emergency systems failed one by one as the fusion plasma burned through conduits and overloaded capacitors. Beautiful, Dr. Chen breathed, watching the facility's lights go out in sequence. Jacob activated his comm unit. All teams, rally at Extraction Point Alpha. The package has been delivered. The extraction point was a drainage tunnel that connected to the old Seattle Metro system, about 2 kilometers from the Orc facility. Jacob's team reached it first, having had the shortest distance to travel, but they could hear plasma weapon fire in the distance as teams Alpha and Bravo fought their way through the facility's outer perimeter. The tunnel was dark and filled with knee-deep water that stank of industrial chemicals. Dr. Chen had to hold her tablet above her head to keep it dry, while Jacob and Davis carried the improvised weapons and equipment they'd managed to salvage. Above them, the sounds of the dying facility echoed through the drainage system, metal groaning as structural supports failed, the distant rumble of secondary explosions as damaged equipment overloaded. Team Charlie is at the rally point, Jacob reported into his comm unit. What's your status, Alpha? Vasquez's voice came back strained. We're moving, but we've got multiple Orc units in pursuit. Torres is covering our withdrawal, but his team took casualties during the power hub assault. Jacob checked his watch. They'd been underground for 15 minutes, and the facility's backup power systems would be coming online soon. Once the Orcs regained full sensor capability, hunting down the escaped prisoners would become much easier. Understood. Move fast, but don't take unnecessary risks. The tunnel system should provide good concealment as long as we stay below ground. Dr. Chen was using her tablet to monitor electromagnetic emissions from the surface, tracking the status of the Orc facility's recovery efforts. Their main power grid is completely down, she reported. But I'm detecting localized power sources coming online. They're probably switching to emergency generators. How long before they're back to full capability? Hard to say. Could be hours, could be days. Depends on how much damage we actually cause to their infrastructure. The sound of splashing water echoed from further down the tunnel, and Jacob raised his weapon. But it was Vasquez leading the survivors of Team Alpha, 7 prisoners moving in tactical formation through the drainage system. Several of them were wounded, and one was being carried by 2 of his teammates. Good to see you made it, Jacob said as Vasquez approached. What about Torres? Last I saw, he was holding a position at the main tunnel junction to cover our retreat. His team had lost 3 people, but they were still fighting. Vasquez's expression was grim. We need to keep moving. The Orcs were bringing up heavy weapons when we extracted. Jacob nodded. The plan had always assumed casualties. They were fighting a guerrilla action against a technologically superior enemy. But losing Torres would be a significant blow to their chances of long-term survival. They moved deeper into the tunnel system, following routes that Jacob had memorized during their planning phase. The Seattle Metro had been built with multiple redundant pathways, and many of the tunnels connected to natural cave systems in the surrounding hills. If they could reach the mountains, they might be able to link up with other resistance cells. 20 minutes later, they heard the distinctive sound of human voices calling out from behind them. Jacob held up his hand, bringing the group to a halt while he tried to identify the source. The echoes in the tunnel system made it difficult to determine direction, but it sounded like someone was trying to catch up with them. Morrison! Wait up! It was Torres's voice. Jacob felt a surge of relief as the Master Chief emerged from the darkness, leading the 3 survivors of Team Bravo. Torres himself was limping badly, and blood was seeping through his uniform shirt, but he was alive and mobile. Thought we'd lost you, Jacob said, clasping the older man's shoulder. Takes more than a few Orc plasma rifles to put down an old sailor, Torres replied with a grin. We held them off long enough for the facility's security grid to go completely dark. After that, it was just a matter of slipping away in the confusion. Dr. Chen looked up from her tablet. I'm not detecting any pursuit. Their sensors are still offline, and these tunnels should provide good electromagnetic shielding even when they get their systems back online. Jacob did a quick head count. 22 survivors out of the 47 who had started the mission. The casualties were painful, but they'd accomplished their primary objective. The Orc facility was crippled, and its strategic value significantly reduced. Where to now? Asked Corporal Davis. Jacob pulled out his hand-drawn map of the regional tunnel system. We follow this main drainage line for about 10 kilometers until it connects with the old freight rail tunnel. From there, we can access the Cascade foothills and hopefully link up with other resistance units. The journey through the underground took most of the night. They moved in tactical formation, with scouts ahead and behind to watch for signs of pursuit. The tunnel system was a maze of intersections and branch passages, some of which had been blocked by debris from the Orc bombardment during the initial invasion. At one point, they had to detour around a section where the tunnel had partially collapsed, forcing them to crawl through a narrow passage filled with mud and broken concrete. Dr. Chen's tablet was their only source of light, its screen glowing faintly in the absolute darkness of the underground. They reached the freight rail tunnel just before dawn. The massive concrete tube stretched ahead of them into darkness, its rails long since removed for scrap metal. Water dripped steadily from the ceiling, and the air carried the musty smell of decades of abandonment. This tunnel runs for about 30 kilometers before it reaches the Cascade foothills, Jacob explained to the group. It should be completely invisible to Orc aerial surveillance, but we'll need to be careful about motion sensors and automated patrols. They were resting and sharing their meager food supplies when Torres approached Jacob with a concerned expression. We need to talk, the Master Chief said quietly. Some of the people are starting to question whether this was worth it. Jacob looked around at the exhausted, dirty faces of their fellow survivors. They'd been prisoners for months, and now they were fugitives hiding in abandoned tunnels with no clear plan for the future. He could understand their doubts. What are they saying? That maybe we should have stayed put. At least in the facility, we had food and shelter. Out here, Torres gestured at the dark tunnel around them. We're just delaying the inevitable. It was a fair point. The Orcs controlled most of North America, and their technology gave them an overwhelming advantage in any conventional conflict. A small group of escaped prisoners wasn't going to change the strategic balance of the war. But Jacob had learned something important during their time in captivity. The Orcs weren't invincible. Their technology was advanced, but it was also specialized and vulnerable to disruption. Their command structure was hierarchical and slow to adapt to unexpected situations. And most importantly, they underestimated human ingenuity and determination. Tell them we're not running away, Jacob said. We're regrouping. Every Orc facility we damage, every supply line we disrupt, every day we keep fighting, it all adds up. Maybe we can't win this war by ourselves, but we can make it expensive for them to occupy our world. Torres nodded slowly. I'll pass the word. But some of these people aren't soldiers, Morrison. They're scared and tired and they want to go home. Home doesn't exist anymore, Jacob replied. Not the way it was. But maybe we can build something new. They resumed their journey through the freight tunnel, moving at a steady pace despite their exhaustion. Dr. Chen had rigged her tablet to monitor for electromagnetic signatures, and so far there was no indication that the Orcs had detected their escape route. The tunnel began to slope upward as they approached the foothills, and Jacob could feel the air pressure changing. Somewhere far above them, the sun was rising on another day of the occupation. But down here in the darkness, a small group of humans was still fighting back. As they walked, Jacob found himself thinking about the bigger picture. The Orc invasion had been swift and overwhelming, but it wasn't complete. There were still pockets of human resistance scattered across the planet, still military units operating from hidden bases, still civilians refusing to submit to alien rule. The facility they just destroyed had been extracting materials for the Orc war machine. Every ton of rare earth minerals they couldn't mine was one less weapon they could build, one less ship they could fuel, one less step toward completing their conquest of Earth. It wasn't much, but it was a beginning. The tunnel finally emerged into daylight at the mouth of a canyon in the Cascade foothills. Jacob cautiously surveyed the area through the tunnel entrance, looking for signs of Orc presence. The canyon was overgrown with vegetation and showed no evidence of recent activity. This is where we start the real journey, he told the group. From here, we move into the mountains and begin looking for other resistance cells. It won't be easy, but we're not prisoners anymore. We're soldiers again. Dr. Chen powered down her tablet to conserve battery life. The facility's power grid should be down for at least another 12 hours, she reported. After that, they'll probably have enough backup power to resume limited operations. Then we better put some distance between us and them, Vasquez said. I don't want to be anywhere near here when they get their sensors back online. Jacob nodded and began leading the group up the canyon toward the tree line. Behind them, smoke was still rising from the Orc facility, a pillar of black against the morning sky. It was a small victory in a war that seemed hopeless, but it was proof that the Orcs could be hurt. And if they could be hurt, they could be beaten.